In 1931, 6 novices walked into St. Margaret's Convent to prepare for their final vows. Not a single one was ever seen again, no bodies, no records, no questions asked. The town of Halberd, Maine, population 304 in the year 1930, was the sort of place you couldn't find without already knowing where to look. No main road, no train stop, just mist, forest, and a chapel's bell that rang whether there was wind or not. On the edge of this forgotten township stood St. Margaret's Convent, an 1850s brick monolith with no history in local records before 1890, no blueprints, no founding date, just a black and white photo of 11 women in habits, their faces blurred by age or something worse. Whispers of the cloister that doesn't open flickered through neighboring counties, spoken only by drunkards and gravediggers. Locals claimed the nuns didn't age, that they never left. That if you stood at the fence at night, you'd hear a child crying from inside, though the convent housed no children, just sisters and secrets. 6 postulants arrived by cart in February of 1931, one of the coldest winters Halberd had seen. They were young, innocent, seeking salvation, but whatever faith they carried was devoured by what waited behind St. Margaret's stone gates, and what the church buried, Halberd never forgave. Clara, Elsie, Margaret, Jo, Beatrice, and Anne. The 6 girls sent to St. Margaret's in 1931 were daughters of devout Catholic families across the eastern seaboard. Chosen for their purity and obedience, their acceptance letters bore the cardinal's seal, but none of the bishops in Portland would claim them after their disappearance. Clara's younger brother remembered her eyes the night before she left, like she was already dreaming someone else's dream. Each girl had been orphaned by disease, war, or God's timing, as the parish liked to call it. To the outside world, they were burdens placed lovingly in the church's care. To St. Margaret's, they were offerings. The day they arrived, the Mother Superior, Sister Evangelina, locked the iron gate behind them herself. No goodbyes, no visitors, and no word ever left again. The only thing ever found was a page torn from one of their prayer journals. It read, "We were not meant to take vows. We were meant to be taken." Beneath the east chapel of the convent lay what the nuns called the silent cloister. Supposedly bricked off in 1896 after a structural collapse, the wing had no documented purpose. Yet every girl was warned not to approach the corridor behind the choir loft. Sister Evangelina called it a place where sins echo longer than prayers. But the echoes came anyway. At night, the novices reported hearing footsteps where no feet walked, soft sobbing from stone walls, and a voice, male, ancient, not Latin, not English, but something that spoke directly into the marrow. Margaret, whose family practiced minor exorcisms back in Philadelphia, was the first to call it a threshold, not a room, but a veil, a place where time and soul collapsed. On the 12th night, she disappeared for 7 hours. When she returned, her hair was white, her fingers bloody, and her tongue cut at the root. She never spoke again, but the next morning, 5 dead birds lay at the foot of the altar, arranged in the shape of an inverted cross. The Mother Superior declared a day of silence. It lasted 3 weeks. Nobody knew where she came from. There was no baptismal record, no convent transfer papers. Sister Evangelina simply appeared at St. Margaret's sometime in the late 1800s. Her name means bearer of good news, yet everything she touched withered. They said her eyes were the color of spoiled milk, clouded, milky, yet the girls who met her swore they saw themselves reflected in her pupils, only twisted. Older, hollow, wrong. She never prayed aloud, never joined the other sisters in worship, and yet she wielded absolute control. It was Evangelina who led the midnight cleansings, where novices were dragged one by one into the confessional and returned trembling, bruised, and silent. She said it was a purification before vows, but none of the girls ever made it to that ceremony, and none of the sisters ever asked why. To look into Sister Evangelina's eyes was to feel something ancient waking up inside you, something not yours. Something borrowed, something hungry. Months after the girls vanished, a groundskeeper's dog unearthed a rusted tin box near the west garden. Inside was a torn black journal bound with rosary twine. The handwriting matched Beatrice Noel, one of the 6 missing girls. Pages were soaked in what appeared to be communion wine or blood. It was hard to tell. She wrote, "The bells ring even when there's no one left to pull the rope. They chant the Lord's Prayer backwards in the refectory, and it works." Clara tried to run. The black door opened. The walls screamed her name. On the last page, Beatrice describes a night when the novices were forced to stand naked in front of a veiled altar, hands bound in cloth, chanting a name that burned their throats, Malach, Malach, Malach. The name doesn't exist in any saint registry, but it does appear in a banned 14th century demonological text. Clara was the first to disappear. One day, she stood in the garden holding an apple, red as blood. The next, only the apple remained on the chapel steps, bitten once, rotting in the center. A note was pinned to it. She tried to repent. The confessional smelled of sulfur for days after. Sister Teresa, the kindest nun among them, was found catatonic, seated in the opposite booth. Her hair had fallen out in clumps, and she whispered only one thing over and over. "The veil has thinned." She saw him. The priest assigned to the convent, Father Mallory, was called in to perform a cleansing. He never made it past the gate. Witnesses from the town say they saw him fall to his knees and weep, clutching his crucifix until his fingers bled. He was taken to an asylum 3 weeks later. Clara was never mentioned again. Her name was scratched off the convent's logbook, as if she had never been, but every night at 3:00 a.m., the other girls heard soft knocking from the inside of the wall behind the prayer hall. 3 knocks. Then silence. In the convent's eastern corridor, just outside the sleeping quarters, there hung an old grandfather clock. It had no hands, no pendulum, and no mechanical function. Yet every night at precisely 3:03 a.m., it rang once, loud enough to wake the girls, but never the elder nuns. Beatrice recorded the pattern in her journal. Day 1, the bell rang once. Day 2, a second chime 2 minutes later. Day 3, a voice whispered, "Open it." On day 7, the wall behind the clock began to crack, forming what looked like a jagged doorway. The girls blocked it with a heavy wardrobe. The next morning, the wardrobe was in flames, without fire, without ash. It simply glowed, then vanished. There were no fireplaces in that wing, no matches allowed. And the Mother Superior offered no explanation. That night, Jo woke up screaming. Her sheets had been twisted into a noose coiled neatly under her bed. The clock rang twice more. The purpose of a novitiate is to prepare for final vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But at St. Margaret's, none of the girls were ever seen taking them. Instead, they were led through a strange ritual called the dimming, a candle-lit procession at midnight, where the novices were stripped of their crosses and blindfolded. Led into a stone room beneath the altar, they were told to recite the Apostles' Creed, but backward, Beatrice wrote, "The prayers don't call to God, they awaken something else." After each ritual, one of the girls would fall sick. Nosebleeds, tremors, one even forgot her own name for days. On the night of Margaret's dim, she bit through her tongue, trying not to scream. When her veil was removed, her eyes had turned entirely black. No iris, no sclea, just void. Sister Evangelina called it a mark of spiritual passage. Margaret never spoke again. They called her the Hollow Bride. Every nun at St. Margaret spoke of a boy with no name, seen only in reflections and shadows. He carried a broken lantern and wore a cassock 2 sizes too large, as if dressed for burial. No records mention him. No orphanage claimed him. Yet each girl described him identically. He would appear in mirrors during evening wash, or in the ink wells of the study room, standing behind them. Never moving, just staring. Beatrice said she saw him nod once, just once, on the day Jo vanished. That night, the novices found Jo's habit folded on her bed. Her veil was soaked with oil. On the mirror above her bunk was a smeared handprint, small as a child's. Etched into the glass, she walked too far down. The convent had no basement, or so they thought. One of the oldest rites at St. Margaret's was the stone baptism, an archaic ritual predating even Catholic canon. The novices were submerged not in water, but in a black basin of mineral oil said to represent the flood of silence. The oil was cold, thick. It took minutes to breathe again after the dunk. Beatrice wrote, "You feel like you're being watched from inside the oil, like it remembers drowning." Anne refused the ritual. She said she heard a voice whisper her real name, one no one else could know, while she was underwater. She went missing 3 days later. Her rosary was found frozen in the basin. When authorities were notified, the basin was gone, removed overnight. The sisters claimed it never existed. But in the margins of the convent's oldest prayer book, one phrase was scratched over and over: "Stone remembers blood." Behind a rusted door marked Archivum Demonium lay the convent's forbidden records. The girls weren't allowed inside, but Beatrice did, once. She described it as a cathedral of whispers, a floor-to-ceiling shelves of unmarked leather books, all with titles scrawled in tongues she couldn't read. Some were bound in skin, others bled when touched. One book fell open on its own, a catalogue of names, all female, all crossed out. Some dated back to 1812. Only one name was left uncrossed: Beatrice Noel. She tore the page out, ran. The next day, Sister Agnella, who oversaw the archives, was found dead in the corridor, a quill jammed through her left eye. No one spoke of it. The archive door was bricked shut by evening. But the page with Beatrice's name was never found. In early April, the chapel organ began to play at night, on its own. At first, it was hymns. Then it became discordant, descending into melodies that stirred panic in the belly. The nuns claimed it was the wind, but the girls knew otherwise. They heard voices. Beatrice wrote, "It sings what it remembers." The choir stalls became suffocating. The carved wooden faces on the pews began to twist, subtly, into shrieking expressions. One girl, Elsie, refused to enter the chapel again. She claimed to hear her mother's voice coming from beneath the floorboards, begging her not to kneel. The organ played louder every night, then silence. On the Feast of St. Agnes, the sisters held an unscheduled mass. The choir sang. But none of the girls had mouths. Their faces were veiled in gauze, their throats stitched shut with red thread. Only the eyes remained, wide, terrified, pleading. Elsie disappeared the next day. No scream, no trace, just a rosary with 7 beads melted together. May 13th marked the Feast of Severance, a ceremony no one outside the convent had ever heard of. It wasn't in the liturgical calendar. It wasn't in any Catholic doctrine. That night the girls were dressed in black, not white, and led in procession to the crypt beneath the chapel. Candles burned blue, a bell rang 7 times. No one explained why. They were made to kneel around a sealed stone well known as the Chalice of Flesh. Carvings around the rim depicted figures in robes cutting their own faces. Sister Evangelina stood over the well, chanting in an ancient tongue. Beatrice wrote she wasn't calling God, she was feeding something. Anne collapsed, her skin blistered, her mouth foamed. She screamed, "There's something at the bottom looking back." They dragged her away. That was the last time any of the girls saw her. The well was gone the next morning, as if it had never existed. But from then on, every time Beatrice closed her eyes, she saw teeth in the dark, waiting. A small candle burned in the hallway outside the novices' cells. Placed there as a symbol of devotion, it never went out, even in wind, even in water. One night, Jo attempted to snuff it after waking to screams from the prayer room. Her fingers blistered just from nearing the flame. She said she heard a voice whisper from the candle, "You will burn too." After Jo's disappearance, the candle grew longer, against logic, against fire. It dripped wax upward. Beatrice tried to move it. It reappeared the next morning, back in place, burning silently. A visiting priest from Massachusetts tried to bless it. He vomited blood and passed out before finishing the rite. The candle never flickered. It just burned, patiently, as if waiting. For weeks, the girls complained of a scratching noise behind the stone walls. At first it was faint, like a rat, then louder, rhythmic. Like breathing, when Beatrice pressed her ear to the stone, she felt warmth, then fingers. The wall pushed back. Sister Evangelina dismissed it as hysteria. But that same week, claw marks appeared on the frescoes, deep gouges across the faces of the saints. Margaret began to bleed from her ears every night at 2:03 a.m. Her face grew pale, her pupils unresponsive. She stopped responding to her name. When asked who she was, she whispered, "He is me." After that, she smiled constantly, and her shadow no longer matched her movements. The bell tower of St. Margaret's had been silent for decades, but on the eve of Pentecost it rang 13 times. There was no one inside. The toll shook the convent like thunder. Windows cracked, birds died mid-flight. A nun on night watch went blind in both eyes instantly. The townspeople heard it too. Several claimed they saw a black mist drift down from the tower and crawl across the field like fingers. Beatrice swore the bell was calling something up, not down. That night, all 6 remaining novices dreamed the same dream, a staircase descending forever. And at the bottom, a mirror that didn't show their faces, only a robed man with a black halo and no eyes. Doors began to appear where there were none, behind beds, beneath pews, etched into stone, always black, always shut. 13 in total. Each bore a different sigil, a spiral, a bleeding eye, a serpent devouring its own tongue. Beatrice opened one. What she saw was never written, but the next page in her journal was torn out. Burned around the edges, scribbled on the back was a single phrase: "We were the sacrifice." One by one, the other novices vanished. The final door appeared behind the altar, and Sister Evangelina stood beside it, smiling. By June 1931, the convent was reported abandoned. Locals who ventured near found no gate, no structure, just overgrown weeds and a stone statue of a veiled nun with her hands folded. Her face had no features. Official church records list St. Margaret's as demolished due to fire damage. But there was no fire. No ashes, just absence. Every photograph of the building degraded into static. No one remembered who funded it. No order claimed its existence. But sometimes in the church archives of old dioceses, the name Evangelina appears, over and oversigned beneath blacked-out ledgers. And always with the same Latin phrase, vota non scripta, vocati sunt, no vows written, they were called. Years later, during a demolition project in Portland, workers uncovered a bricked-up vault beneath a defunct parish building. Inside, they found an oil-soaked book, Beatrice's journal. The final page was untouched, fresh, as if written yesterday. It read, "If you find this, leave, burn it. She still waits. We were never meant to take vows. We were meant to feed what hides behind them." The last line was written in red. Evangelina is not a nun. She is the vow. Today, St. Margaret's is gone. But on certain nights, when the mist rolls in from the east, locals say they still hear bells, a single chime. At 3:03 a.m., and on rare occasions, travelers find a candle burning in the field where the chapel once stood. It cannot be moved, it cannot be extinguished, and standing behind it, always at a distance, is a tall, veiled figure in black robes. She does not move, she only watches. Some say if you stare long enough, she raises her hand and beckons, and if you follow, you do not return, because some vows are never broken, and some nuns never needed to take them.